In an unprecedented case, groups of Canadian citizens have united to bring an ex parte motion before federal court in Toronto, Ontario. The International Tribunal of Crimes of Church and State and the Association of Citizen Prosecutors intend to seek direction with respect to how best to proceed to bring criminal indictments against fraternal organizations alleging their crimes against humanity and the citizens of Canada.
A historic matter we're bringing forward in federal court on behalf of victims of church, state, criminal conspiracies, actually. And we're actually now working with the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State.
In his lengthy affidavit to the federal court, Jason J. Bowman has outlined how these fraternities began their lodges hand in hand with the development of Canada's political parties, choosing Conservative Party member Brother John A. MacDonald to lead the party to serve as Canada's first Prime Minister, a lineage of brotherly Prime Ministers that continue to this day. In 1873, these fraternities also began the Northwest Mounted Police that saw Mounties swearing one oath in service to the citizens and yet another superseding oath in service to their fraternal brotherhood. Hand in hand, these fraternities, using royal decrees, then their written legislation, beginning with the Indian Act of 1876, began usurping native lands while committing a quiet genocide of the indigenous peoples that is alleged to continue to this day.
The Indian Act of Canada is race-based legislation that legally separates Indigenous people into a separate and inferior class of citizenship under the control of one man, the Federal Minister of Indian Affairs. The Indian Act allows Aboriginal people to be expelled from their homes on reserved lands, arbitrarily jailed, subjected to involuntary medical treatment, and denied the right to elect their own leaders. Under the Indian Act, Native people are legal wards of the Canadian state in perpetuity, having the same status as children or the mentally incompetent. This racist legislation has remained essentially unchanged since it was first enacted in 1876. Its philosophy and regulations were drafted under the guidance of the Roman Catholic and Anglican churches through the Bagot Commission created by the Vatican in 1845. The Government of Canada enacted the recommendations of this commission in 1857 when it passed the Gradual Civilization Act. This legislation forced Indigenous people to surrender their land and identity and denied them any future title to their land, which was now owned entirely by the Crown.
For thousands of years, it is said that the First Nations peoples have lived harmoniously with these lands.
Kevin Annett from BC, a whistleblowing former minister of the United Church of Canada, had gone ahead and come forward with information that he has, startling, troubling information, which we're bringing immediately to federal court.
Lots of stories were told, including a whole hidden history of how the church had been selling off native land. There were backroom deals going on with stolen native land, and I called the church on that, and they showed me the door.
The notice of motion in part names the Vatican, the Queen of England, the Harper government, and pharmaceutical entities, alleging in part the quiet genocide and mistreatment of the Indigenous peoples of Canada through diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis, through residential schools, and through sterilizations.
A study of a general called Geoffrey Amherst, and Amherst, Nova Scotia is named after him. He was a British general who conducted germ warfare against the Mi'kmaq Indians in Nova Scotia, and in the 1740s he kept a journal of this, and he was so brazen he didn't hesitate to record what he was doing in the journal, again because they didn't figure they'd ever have to answer to anybody since they were the law. And in it he describes how they would go into hospitals where their own people had been dying of smallpox, and they took the blankets and he gave it to one of his subordinates, a major, who then took it out among the Mi'kmaq and the other Indians who were allied with the French, like the Huron and the Algonquin-speaking Indians in the eastern part of Canada. They were targeted. In fact, most of the Huron were exterminated by smallpox. Germ warfare.
Tuberculosis was another weapon in the arsenal of germ warfare used against Native people in Canada. A fiercely communicable disease, spread quickly by air and contaminated food, Tuberculosis was responsible for many of the deaths of children in Indian residential schools across Canada. According to government officials like Dr. Peter Bryce, residential school staff deliberately and regularly exposed healthy Indian children to tuberculosis by forcing them to sleep and play alongside children dying of the disease, and then denying them aid or treatment. It was this murderous practice that was responsible for an annual death rate in the residential schools of nearly 50%.
I began to find these records from a report by a guy called Dr. Peter Bryce, he was head medical officer for Indian Affairs. And in 1907, he went on a tour of all the schools out here, like on the coast and in prairies. And he found that he claims that over half the children were dying every year from tuberculosis. And specifically from a practice whereby healthy children were brought in and housed alongside children dying of tuberculosis, and then none of them were treated or helped in any way. They were left to die of this communicable disease. And Dr. Bryce, I mean, this is not some flaming radical. He's an establishment doctor who's reporting back to his boss, Duncan Campbell Scott, who's head of Indian Affairs. And he said in his report, the quote is, "I believe that conditions are being deliberately created to spread infectious diseases." So he was clear, children were being deliberately murdered by a practice of contaminating them with TB. This book is used in the university curriculum about residential schools. It has been for almost 10 years. And here's a picture of children with active tuberculosis sores. You see the bandages around their head. And the inscription says they have active, like open tubercular sores, and they're sitting here alongside healthy children. That was the practice described by Dr. Peter Bryce when he said they were being deliberately exposed to diseases. They weren't being quarantined. When you have tuberculosis, you're quarantined. You don't sit with healthy children. This is proof. This is proof of intent to commit genocide. This picture right here.
There were also doctors, like George Darby, who would take the United Church boat over to the hospital at Bella Bella, British Columbia, to sterilize First Nations women against their will.
He made an announcement in our village that anyone who wasn't in church on Sunday had to report to him for a special procedure. I never went to his United Church since they did so much harm. But Darby was missionary, so his word was law. So the Mounties came and got me and brought me to Darby. He gave me a shot. Next thing I knew, I was in bed, all bruised and hurting. I was missing all my gold teeth. Something didn't feel right inside me. I never could conceive after that. Later, another doctor told me I'd been sterilized. George Darby, he did that to hundreds of our women.
One of the documents I found is a thing called the Application for Admission Form. And it's a document that every Native parent had to sign or they'd go to jail. And what it did was it actually surrendered guardianship rights to the principal of the residential school. So what this did is you had to sign away the guardianship power of your own child to the clergyman who ran the residential school. And at that point, that principal of that school then became the legal guardian of the kids. So that explains why these things could happen, how it could happen. Because they were the legal guardian, they could do whatever they wanted to these kids. Point pointing out that the church was selling off native land to its corporate buddy, the big logging company, McMillan Bloedel. The fact that I wrote about that and was turfed so quickly out of the church is proof right there that, you know, the Achilles heel here is the issue of the land. How was it gotten? When you look at the mechanics of how the land was taken, it's out and out murder, mass murder.
That's exactly what I feel. There was genocide.
When God is on our side, we can commit any crime. We're absolved individually from that crime by believing that we have a higher sanction. And that's the danger of religion, in that it allows people to do that. It allows them to kill without a shred of conscience.
We have a date on July 9th, 2012 at 9:30 a.m. to proceed on an ex parte basis, which essentially means we'll be acting without the other parties, seeking clarification actually from the court pursuant to the relevant rules of federal procedure in respect of this matter. As we see a series of criminal conspiracies set in place by various entities. These parties, by the way, that are alleged by us to be included in these criminal conspiracies, many of the people and parties that we have named in this lawsuit and in this action are people who hold public office.
God hides himself in the most broken ones among us, and God hides himself in the most broken parts of ourselves, hidden in there, but present, like a little seed. And I'd say that our worst experiences are a way to reveal that, and for us to find a new meaning and strength in our life. Because when you lose everything for the right reason, for a just cause, or for people who can't fight for themselves, when you stand with them and lose everything, you gain everything.
All those interested in joining this class action lawsuit can obtain more information at acpcanada.wordpress.com.
La